Great, so we built our component which uses props to get data from the parent. We can then use it in a function as we do here. Maybe it's a reusable component you want to use in multiple places, and in each place it gets different data, but of course the type of data should always be equal. So here, where we reverse the name, well, this will not work if you pass in a number or a boolean. It has to be a string this component gets. So in order to make sure we're not getting an error due to someone passing, let's say, 1 here, keep the dynamic binding to pass a number instead of a string. Well, that of course will break the application, as you can tell here, because we can't use split on a number. So in order to prevent this, we want to validate the props coming in. And we can set up validation here in this props array or in this props key here on our object. Props can not only be an array. If we want to validate it, it should be an object. And there we have as a key our property name, like my name. And then as a value, the type of that. So that could be of type string to force it to be of type string. You could also say it can be multiple types. So since we basically only want to reverse it, you could also say this should be of type string or array. So by passing an array of types here, you can say it can have multiple types. Multiple types are valid. Though here I want to revert back to just using string. So with this, I'm making sure that I'm only getting the data I want to get. Now what happens if I set up the validation here and pass a 1? Now if I save this and I open the console and reload the page here, you see now I'm getting a warning that the prop check did fail and the whole component is therefore not attached like this. So I'm still getting an error, of course, because what else should Vue.js do? It can't prevent me from typing a wrong code there. But I do get such warnings at development time, and thus I might recognize that somewhere I'm using the wrong property. And by adding validation like this, I'm making sure that inside of this component, I can be sure that I only get strings, because otherwise my application will throw an error anyways and will give me at development time a warning. When setting up the types of properties, you can do even more than just setting the type like this. This could now also be an object where you set the type with the type key, and you could also set required to true to make sure this is a property which always is a string, and it should always be available, it should always be passed. If you don't set required, it would be valid to use your component like this and to not pass this name. Well, by setting required to true, you're making sure this component may only be used if this component, or excuse me, if this property is passed. So that's an addition when setting up prop validation to make sure that your component definitely has what it needs to run optimally. You can also set a default value to make sure that, well, you have something to work with. Now, of course, default doesn't make sense together with required, because how would you have a default if it's required anyways? The default would always get overwritten. So default would be set to, in the case of a string, some string like max. So that now if I remove this, my name here, and I'm not passing a property, I'm still getting max passed down there, as you can see by the reversed name. I'll revert this nonetheless. And if you would have, let's say, an object or array here, so if you have type object, let's say, doesn't make sense here, but if you would have this, well, then the default should always be a function which returns the object structure it should have, or the default object you want to use, like name max. Again, doesn't make sense for this use case, but just to let you know how that would look like, you would use such a function if that is of type object or array. For primitive types like string, boolean, and number, so like string we used before, you set it directly to that value you want to use though. This is how you validate props and how you make sure that the properties, the props you're working with, actually have the format you need them to have.